Afternoon, everyone. I'm Thomas Murray Dawson with Center for Political Education. I'm joining you from the occupied lands of the Ohlone people in the East Bay of California. We encourage all our participants on this call located in the Bay Area to pay your Shumi land tax, which you can do by following the link in the chat. The chat, as always, will be disabled for these calls, except for us to share information with the audience. So if you have questions you'd like to get answered during the call, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll try our best to answer them there. In that same toolbar, you can find the CC button to enable closed captioning, and we're also grateful to have ASL interpreters on hand throughout this call. On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, our Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join the ongoing solidarity work for Palestine in the Bay Area. Today's agenda. Today's agenda is as follows. First, Melissa Fan will lead us in a 5-minute semantics practice to ground us and build resilience for the work ahead. And then Samar Arabi from AROC will join us on site at an emergency demonstration that's happening in San Francisco to protest a U.S. warship that is headed for Gaza to provide more military support for Israel's campaign of ethnic cleansing. The demonstration is taking place right now at Brandon Street Wharf Park, and you can text Gaza to 833-633-0604 for alerts. Again, that's 833-633-0604 for alerts. And if you've texted the PSA to that number, you've already gotten the text. And just a programming note, if Samar occurs any issues with his reception, I'll do my best to fill in for him and provide updates from this past week. We were initially scheduled to have our comrades from Haiti Action join, but they'll be joining us next week, and I will be announcing an important event that will be happening next Saturday that Haiti Action is hosting to help do political education and inform folks in the Bay Area about what's happening in Haiti right now. With that, I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here today. Let's practice who we need to be in the world in order to free Palestine, end empire, and achieve collective liberation. I know that a lot of us are feeling fatigued, feeling physically, psychologically, and emotionally exhausted. That's a very normal response to witnessing a genocide being streamed in real time every single day for the last 5, almost 6 months. That's also what empire is betting on, that we burn out and lose momentum. And we're not going to let that happen. We are here in this struggle for the long haul, and we refuse to burn out. So let's deepen our practice of grounding in the earth today. We turn to earth-based somatic practices because the earth is always there for us. No matter where we are, no matter what we're experiencing, the earth is always there, always holding us. We are from and of the earth, so we can always, always turn to the earth for resourcing in service of collective liberation, which includes earth and climate justice in Palestine and around the world. So, finding yourself in a comfortable position, having your feet planted on the floor or the ground. And just noticing, beginning to notice the bottoms of your feet, finding all of your toes, if that helps. And making sure to modify this for yourself. Yeah. The point of these practices isn't perfection, but it's about being in connection with the earth. So if that means that it's another body part for you, yeah, that works. And just beginning to root into the earth. If you're in a building, feeling roots grow through and down through the building, finding dirt below. And as you're finding this earth below all of us, really imagine connecting with the mycelial networks that exist, that connect the plants and the trees, some of which have been around for millennia. And as you're rooting in the earth, also beginning to connect to your breath. Simply noticing the pace of your breathing, if it's shallow or if it's deep. And with each breath, really feeling that it's the trees on land, the greens on land, the algae in the ocean, the kelp in the ocean. Yeah, it's these plants that create the oxygen, which each one of us is breathing right now. So feeling this deep tending, this deep holding, this deep love that Earth has for us. Knowing that it's the Earth that has sustained us for each and every one of our lives and for the collective span of human history. And know that at any time, if you're feeling fatigued, if you're feeling in despair, if the grief is too overwhelming, if the emotions of rage or sadness, of frustration become too much to hold in your body, that you can always, always return to the earth. That's part of decolonization too, is reconnecting to the earth, really feeling this deep gratitude and this relationship, this reciprocal relationship that we have with the earth. Thank you for practicing with me today.
Thank you, Melissa. Now let's bring in Samar to talk about key developments on the ground and in politics this week, and there were quite a few big ones. But first, Samar, let's start by getting an update on what's happening, where you're at with the warship in San Francisco that's slated to head to Gaza and is bringing more U.S. military support for Israel.
Thanks, Thomas. It's great to be here. Sorry, it might be a little bit loud, and I would have loved to show you the crowd, but the rain is pretty heavy, so I am under an awning with a little bit of space behind me, and maybe you can see the warship behind me, the Navy vessel Harvey Milk. incredibly named after a peace activist from San Francisco who fought against dehumanization of people everywhere. Communities learned yesterday that the ship is swinging by its maiden voyage through San Francisco before heading over, from what we've heard on news reports, to Gaza to support the ongoing war effort against the Palestinian people. And like, if the fact that the ship was called the Harvey Milk isn't macabre enough, the type of ship it is uh, a John Lewis Oiler. It's like a class of military vessel, also named after a civil rights icon. The way that sort of like, these leftist movements get co-opted into military parlance is really something. I am hoping to show you the crowd and the folks and what's happening here at some point. But I think I'll start with updates on the political situation and then come back around to how I think all of that is reflecting on what's happening here today. And I think Thomas is very generously going to manage slides for me. My apologies.
No worries. I've got
going
them
on
up.
today.
I've got them up for you.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thanks, Thomas. I appreciate that. So maybe just jumping right into it. Just to the usual, it's been another really intense week of bombardment in Gaza, particularly in Rafah. Like, we're seeing the same sort of ongoing military attack that we've been seeing for the past few weeks, and the same constant imminent threat of a ground invasion that never really seems to materialize. But beyond the situation beyond the sort of immediate military dynamics on the ground, it's been a really big week on the international front. So there's been a lot of movement on a series of international bodies that have all in the same week produced some really damning evidence on Israel's genocide and the ongoing ethnic cleansing campaign that's happening there. The first of which, obviously, and most prominently, is the ceasefire resolution. The Security Council finally passed, after failing to do so, I don't know how many times, a ceasefire resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire for the rest of the month of Ramadan that leads to a sustained, lasting ceasefire. Which itself is a really big move beyond what the U.S. has been basically trying to veto nonstop for the past 6 months. And for the first time, the U.S. didn't veto; it abstained. And that abstention is really important, and it carries a lot of meaningful implications in a lot of different ways. But just to give a little bit of context on what was happening with this resolution, it was a resolution that was brought forward. All these different ceasefire resolutions that the Security Council have been advanced by various member states, right? Sometimes by permanent members, like the U.S., sometimes by the rotating 10 elected members. This time, every single non-permanent member co-sponsored this resolution. And, the fact that all 10 non-permanent members of the Security Council co-signed this resolution, I think is really telling, to demonstrate the extent to which I think the entire international community was trying to demonstrate that it was completely fed up with what the United States has been doing at the Security Council and its intransigence and its sort of obstructionist policies. And so I think just by nature of the resolution and its sponsors, it was going to be really, really hard for the U.S. to veto this resolution, and the pressure for it to let it pass, I think, it was particularly strong this time. Which is not to say that the U.S. didn't try to alter it. They did make a series of pretty big changes. In the 11th hour, they tried to make 3 particular changes to the resolution. They attempted to include a condemnation of Hamas, which they failed to do, and to include a more explicit tying together of the release of hostages and the ceasefire, which I think has been a sort of U.S. strategy for months now, basically to say that a ceasefire is conditional on the release of hostages, right? And to sort of put the onus on Hamas as being the body that's responsible for not getting the ceasefire through. And the obvious implication of that is that Israel has impunity to continue committing these unimaginable massacres because it's not getting what it wants, right? But the non-compliance of one party doesn't give the other party the right to commit whatever crimes it wants, obviously. And so that didn't happen. So the U.S. pressure to change this resolution largely fell flat, which is pretty remarkable. The one thing that it did manage to change in typical U.S. government fashion is that it stripped out the word permanent from the resolution. So the draft, which, we saw the draft in last week's PSA, that draft said an immediate ceasefire leading to a permanent ceasefire. And now the language says a lasting ceasefire. So, I mean, a kind of silly distinction, but an important one nonetheless, I suppose. In terms of the impact that this resolution is going to have, I think like folks, obviously, as soon as the resolution passed through Security Council, there were a lot of questions about what does it actually mean in terms of stopping the violence, in terms of cementing Israel's reputation as a pariah state, in terms of forcing the hand not only of the U.S. military, but of the Israelis themselves and their campaigns. So there isn't a great answer to this at this stage. Things are still a little bit in the air. I will say that I don't think that the Security Council resolution creates an immediate impact on the ground, right? There's a series of complicated considerations there about how the delegitimization of both Israel's position and the United States as a backer of Israel will have really lasting and really important long-term implications. But like, despite the fact that this resolution is a binding resolution forcing all parties to do what the resolution is demanding, and that is, immediate ceasefire and the provision of humanitarian assistance and the return of all hostages. Despite that, like the enforceability of the fact that it's a binding resolution remains a problematic thing because the U.S. is the enforcing sort of, it occupies that like policeman role, right? And so even if other countries wanted to try to enforce this, it would be very difficult for them to do. This Al Jazeera article about like the implications of the ceasefire resolution is a really good one, and I would definitely recommend reading it. We'll, send the slides out afterwards, which have links to all of these stories. And just to say, another impact of this resolution is the emboldening of anti-war movements and anti-war politicians, and basically anyone who has been trying to call for a ceasefire now has the explicit backing of the entire international community. I frequently like to talk about Ro Khanna as like a sort of titular example of a like center-left politician that through mass mobilizations, through direct actions, and through bird dogging has shifted tremendously in his rhetoric on Palestine. And I like, there's a piece in here where he's talking about how views that were once considered fringe are becoming mainstream, right? And like the idea that this anti-war movement has become not just like the language of the street, which it obviously has been for 6 months, but it's also becoming the language of like the political class. And that is a massive departure from where things were. And in the same way, I think that the resolution is emboldening progressives. It's sidelining hardliners, right? And so I think Israel's strong reaction against this resolution really tells you something, both in terms of the ferocity of their response and its powerlessness. Netanyahu immediately said that he was withdrawing the trip to the U.S. to discuss Rafah alternatives, which I think a lot of folks saw happen pretty immediately. And, we talked last week about how Biden was pressuring them to come to see if there was alternatives to the ground invasion. But what folks maybe haven't heard, because it just happened in the past couple of days, is that after so bombastically saying, yeah, we're not coming, absolutely not after the betrayal of the United States, Israel asked for a new date for those meetings to take place for the Rafah offensive plans. And that was, reported in a Al Jazeera article on the next slide. And like, it's it speaks to, I think, the impossible political situation that Netanyahu is in, where he has to both cater to a extreme hard right. Obviously, Netanyahu is himself hard right, but an extreme hard right position of his cabinet members, any one of whom can dissolve the entire government if they pull out of the ruling coalition. And those people are not willing to do like any concessions on what happens in Gaza, right? So like even Netanyahu, who is so dependent on U.S. support to continue to wage this war in ways that we've discussed previously, has to sort of act like he's standing up to the United States while also posing up to them. It's a really odd dynamic where Netanyahu is trying to act like there's daylight between Israel and the U.S., while the U.S. is explicitly saying that there is no daylight. That's like a direct quote from a White House spokesperson, that there's no daylight between the U.S. and Israel, while simultaneously the U.S. is trying to delegitimize Netanyahu himself without delegitimizing the Israeli state writ large. So it's this kind of tangled dance that everybody is trying to work through. And, you know, I think it's an impossible one, right? Like in the same way that Netanyahu can't bridge those various gaps, so too, like the U.S. can't really delegitimize the war that Netanyahu is waging absent the like broader Israeli political class, which has been broadly supportive of the entire war effort. You know, I think like 90% of Israelis support the ongoing war in Gaza. So like the idea of separating those two doesn't really work, but it'll be interesting to see what they try to do to sort of co-opt that language going forward. So those are like the basics of the sort of ceasefire fallout, which I think has also been related to Netanyahu's continuing attempt to have this like, you know, the Rafah offensive, it's coming any day, it's coming. But you know, without a clear date, without a clear plan, and without, frankly, like the military capability to do it. You know, there's an article just a couple of days ago saying that Israel is down to 4 battalions in Gaza, and that's, you know, just to put that in context, I think at the height of their ground campaign there were about 30, and Netanyahu's thing about how a ground operation in Rafah is indispensable is specifically based on the idea that there are 4 battalions of Hamas embedded in Rafah. So like none of the math really adds up. And I think again speaks to the idea that like it's hard to know what they're going to try to do with Rafah, but at the moment a ground incursion still isn't likely, at least in the short term, and definitely not until the new trip of Israeli advisors to the United States is completed. And that trip, like, I think has just been scheduled. So it's going to be a little while. Meanwhile, outside of the ground invasion, I think, you know, apex crime of the Israeli government right now continues to be this coordinated campaign of mass starvation. And, you know, the extent of this organized, facilitated starvation effort is really hitting a fever pitch now, where the level of death from malnutrition has become so high that it's causing a recalculus, I think, of the entire, you know, quote unquote international community and the ways that they engage with this question, and where they're positing the blame. You know, we saw a remarkable event this week where the UN Secretary General went to the border and showed a picture of all of the trucks that are waiting across, and basically explicitly called out Israel for deliberately blocking aid. You know, a lot of you, I think, have seen the news coverage of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, described sort of as this abstract phenomenon, you know, like starvation besets the population of Gaza as if it's just like rainfall. But you're seeing now people very deliberately and explicitly saying that this is a planned and orchestrated aid shortage. And obviously, like, that doesn't really advance U.S. imperial interests in Gaza. So, like, it's a big cause of the underlying friction between the U.S. And Israel in the way that this is being prosecuted. So I did want to touch on a key piece of this, which is something we've talked about a lot on these PSAs, which is the sort of defunding and delegitimization of UNRWA, which I think is important to understand is not just part of the starvation tactics broadly, although it absolutely is. As we've discussed, like UNRWA is a key, like the key operator of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. So undermining them massively increases the vulnerability of the population. But it's important to note that there is a deliberate and years old specific campaign against UNRWA itself, not only because of the aid that it provides, but also because the existence of UNRWA, right, is a UN body that is tasked specifically with supporting Palestinian refugees. And so the idea of UNRWA as a body that supports Palestinian refugees reinforces the concept of Palestinian refugees, which is a daily reminder of their displacement in 1948, which is a regular reminder of the existence of a like a expelled Palestinian population and their right to return. And so Israel is really keen to make sure that that body no longer exists. And meanwhile, the U.S. continues to block funding to UNRWA. The spending bill that was passed this past week prohibits any U.S. funding to UNRWA for the next year. And I didn't include this article in the slides, but you can see it on the media tracker. The Canadian government just a few days ago announced that the U.S. had been pressuring them to keep funding UNRWA. So while the U.S. refuses to fund it itself, it is encouraging its other international partners to keep the funding going because it recognizes the scale of the crisis, but can't help but cave to the sort of like Zionist political lobby that forces them to not fund it domestically. So, I mean, a really craven, frankly, very cowardly political act in that. And I also wanted, talking about sort of the media aspect of things, wanted to note this really remarkable news story from the Washington Post that visualizes the aid shortages in Gaza and shows the sort of extent of their deprivation and really proves that the Israeli government is lying when it says that it's still sending in aid. Like you can see the very sharp drop. It's clearly not sending in aid at any reasonable clip. And a really macabre consequence of that is, as folks have been warning about for months now, the starvation of the entire Gaza Strip obviously also results in the starvation of the Israeli hostages. And this week we saw the first hostage who died from starvation and lack of medicine, which, as you can imagine, has enraged the Israeli street, which continues to sort of rail against the idea that like the way that Israel is managing this military campaign is clearly not in any way looking out for the welfare of the hostages or really an attempt to save the hostages, but is purely about the punishment. And I think that like further delegitimizes the effort both in the international community and even domestically, right? Where like prosecution of the military campaign in Israel remains very popular, but the like specific government officials prosecuting the campaign are unpopular because they're not sort of saving the hostages and things. And it creates this, what the U.S. perceives as a potential wedge. But at the end of the day, like, doesn't change the underlying trajectory of the military campaign. And in the context of like all of this sort of humanitarian crisis, there was a bombshell report that frankly went a little bit underseen this week because of the Security Council resolution produced by the UN Special Rapporteur, Francesca Albanese, who produced a report called Anatomy of a Genocide for the Human Rights Council that really lays out in very explicit detail how Israel is waging this genocidal campaign. And I think it's very remarkable to see a UN body use that language so strongly, but it's also really remarkable to see a report that, UN reports typically follow a really narrow sort of legalistic framework where they, describe legal obligations, they describe the ways that legal obligations haven't been met, and then recommendations for how to fix them. But Albanese goes much further than that, and really takes the time to describe the political context in which this genocide is occurring. And I think that's a really remarkable development that I think will stand as an important historical document. So if you haven't seen this, I'd really recommend reading through it. It's a damning and searing report about the sort of deliberate violence being inflicted on the Palestinian people that now exists like within the UN like public record forever. And in addition to that, the third big report that dropped this week came from the International Court of Justice, which, in response to a request from South Africa a couple of weeks ago, has issued new directives against Israel, saying that the worsening humanitarian situation means that the original orders are no longer sufficient. And as with the original ICJ decisions, the judges ruled anywhere between unanimously and 10-2, and called for increasing humanitarian aid and critically opening up more border crossings. So that itself is a really powerful document that draws directly on the UN Security Council resolution. It references it explicitly multiple times. And so I would definitely give that a read, but I would also note, and I linked in the slides here, to the website where the report is published, because in addition to the orders signed by the ICJ that everybody voted and agreed on, the individual justices themselves have also published their own opinions, and they're extremely powerful and really meaningful, and I would highly recommend looking at some of them. I have some quotes here from Judge Youssef that I think really, again, calls out the genocide very explicitly, saying all indices of genocidal activities are flashing red in Gaza. But it's not just the sort of Arab, third world or global South judges that are talking this way. There's a surprisingly powerful statement from, of all people, the German judge, who says what frankly should have been in the main ruling, which is that the January 26th ICJ ruling called for more humanitarian aid into Gaza. And here we are, months later, and the amount of humanitarian aid has gone down. So obviously, Israel is in non-compliance with the ICJ directives. So that itself is, I think, a really damning thing to hear generally, but a particularly damning one to hear from the German judge on the ICJ. So we're seeing a moment where the entire sort of quote unquote international community is coalescing around this idea of Israel as the pariah state. It's a remarkable drop in its sort of global reputation in months. And I think, obviously we're seeing that shift in rhetoric in the United States, but what we're not seeing yet is a really meaningful shift in US policy and US practice. And we're seeing the ways that those contradictions are sort of eating up the ability of the political class in the US to maintain its legitimacy. So, the biggest piece of that, obviously, and continually, and literally right behind me, is US military assistance to Israel, which continues unabated, completely unabated. And so, it's really important, I think, to recognize that we discussed last week that Israel had submitted its report to the United States about how its military assistance is in compliance with the new Biden directives that they can't send military aid to countries that are committing war crimes. And I mentioned that the odds were very high that they would somehow miraculously find the Israeli government to be in compliance. And the next day after Israel submitted that report, the State Department found preliminarily that indeed Israel is in compliance with its rules, not only on weapons not being used in a way that violates international law, but also that the country wasn't restricting U.S. humanitarian aid, which is a joke, which is the most perverse possible interpretation, given that the U.S. is literally creating a pier to bring aid in because Israel won't let it across the borders. So, like, a thing that is demonstrably, objectively false continues to be sort of parroted in a way that shows that, like, the underlying structures of military assistance to Israel haven't really been jolted off of their tracks yet, in a way that I think is really remarkable and really quite disturbing. And this was all on the next slide. And just to say that it's, like, I think, a really uncomfortable moment for the United States, and a really uncomfortable moment for the government that feels, for a series of reasons that we can, of course, discuss, that it has to continue with these military shipments while recognizing that doing so is not only going against their own stated policies, but is harming them, right? Harming them politically, harming them internationally, not only like they're standing on the global stage, but also Biden's prospects for reelection, right? But they haven't found a way to square that circle. And obviously the only solution to that is that for military aid to stop, and that's something that has come up explicitly in Francesca Albanese's report, which called specifically for not just an end to military support, but an arms embargo and sanctions against the Israeli regime. And also something that came up in several ICJ judges' individual reports. So just to say that, like, this moment is sort of creating unresolvable contradictions for the status quo of the U.S. political system of military assistance. And that's causing, I think, internal ruptures within the U.S. political class. And I think maybe folks saw this week the CNN article that specifically, from a senior State Department official who resigned, who basically mentioned all of these things explicitly, saying, I'm resigning from the State Department because it's so obvious that Israel is committing a genocide, and we have evidence that U.S. officials are aware of it, and everyone is too afraid to speak out. And in her resignation, she mentioned that she's speaking for countless other employees who are too scared to say anything, which is a thing in and of itself. But there's a lot, I think, to unpack there. But just to note that in addition to shifting political class, you're seeing massively shifting public opinion, where the support for U.S. involvement in the Israeli war is greater, where it's now among Democrats in the teens, where the percentage of people who oppose it to support it in the Democratic Party is 4 or 5 to 1 at this point, while Biden sort of continues to refuse to move. And that's, I think, the last context piece that I wanted to go over quickly. In the closings, politics locally, there's the usual things, but also this. It's not too late to join us at Pier 32 if you're in or around San Francisco. And if you can't make it today, but do want to be involved, I do want to encourage you all to check the calendar regularly and to sign up for those text alerts to make sure that you're hearing about these events so that we can mobilize people when we have the opportunity to do so. But we can also discuss the ship and what's happening here with the people's actions too, Thomas, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, before we let you go, well, first of all, thank you for that rundown, comprehensive rundown while you're out on the street. We didn't tell you about becoming an on-the-street reporter before you signed up for this, so we appreciate you doing this. But second, tell us a little bit more about, like, what's the context of today's event? What is Pelosi's involvement, if any, and exactly what is happening at the pier or with the ship or the commemoration of the ship that's going on before it's supposed to leave port.
I will, while doing this, walk over there, so hopefully I can at least show you the people demonstrating outside of the thing. But Yeah, just to note, this is a military refueling ship that's heading to Gaza. So a vessel that is literally fueling the conflict, creating the underlying conditions for this war to continue in a way that, like, glibly through a ship that has just been named the Harvey Milk of all things, like, just demonstrates the utter callousness that underlies the sort of shallow rhetoric of the, like, democratic establishment in this country. And the fact that Nancy Pelosi is showing up to sort of, like, you know, send the ship on its maiden voyage, right? To bless it in its ongoing attempt to sort of fuel this ongoing genocidal war, I think really speaks to the extent that this political class is totally divorced from what its own base is asking for, and for the strong implications of its complicity in genocide. This ship right here is playing a direct role in fueling the genocide of the Palestinian people, right? And that's being done using San Francisco resources. It's being done with our taxpayer dollars. It's being blessed by our congressional representative. And obviously, people are fed up with this idea that it can sort of, like, continue to be business as usual, and Joe Biden can, like, utter some platitudes about a ceasefire. I think this speaks to the fact that, like, people aren't willing to accept these sort of empty gestures anymore. Um, and I think the fact that everyone is willing to show up here in the pouring rain in the hundreds at an extremely last minute notice to keep this ship from effectively moving says a lot about not just, like, San Francisco, but the American people generally. You saw that poll, and their unwillingness to sort of let this continue to get progressively worse every day.
Sammer, to that
Sorry, that was a
point,
bit of an impassioned rant, but you can't be in the crowd and not feel the the vibes.
no, it's perfect. Yeah, I mean, to that point, I think you alluded to it, but should folks continue to come out? Is there still a call for folks to show up? Where are they showing up? Because I think it's ongoing now, and obviously we're going to be wrapping up here. We want to encourage folks to come out and heed AROC's call to action and any other calls to action for the day that you know of at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage folks to come out, and I just want to say, a group of people have just run to the ship. I don't know if you can see it, to try to disrupt the ship's departure. You can see the cops chasing after them, maybe. So yeah, come through. There's a lot happening. I don't know how long we'll be here, but it'll definitely be for a little while. If folks can make it in the next 30 minutes or so, it's certainly worth it. And you can always reach out on the text blast system. It is a two-way system. So if you have questions on whether things are ongoing, you can reach out and we can let you know whether the folks are dispersing or not. But if anything, it seems like things are just picking up.
Sammer, thanks so much for doing this on such short notice and being out there. Again, folks, text that number 833-633-0604. Text Gaza to that number, and you will get updates throughout the day and moving forward, not only about the PSA, but about these actions. And stay tuned and stay active and engaged. Sammer, we're going to let you go so you can go out and be part of the demonstration, and so others can join you. In the meantime, I do want to close out on a couple of small programming notes and some announcements. First, I do want to direct our attention, and just bear with us as I do this, but I do want to pull up so you have a sense of other direct actions that are going on. Let me just pull up my screen here. And I believe Mara is dropping some of the requisite links that Sammer always gives us to sign up for the PAL Media Tracker, and to go and visit the page for AROC events. In addition to what's happening today, there's a People's Tribunal that's happening tomorrow. And we shared some of that information last week. It's happening in Castro Valley. We are also, there's also a Gaza Solidarity bike ride. And then one of the more notable actions for tomorrow is the Land Day protest, which I will click on here. and which Mara will drop a link in the chat about, which is happening tomorrow. Segurate Land Trust and sorry, this is the right link. Segurate Land Trust and Palestinian Youth Movement are two of the co-sponsors. It's happening between 4 and 7 p.m. It's an art build and a day of prayer at the West Berkeley Shell Mound. So I encourage you all to take a look at this calendar again. And then I also want to drop some information right now. Mara, if you could drop the information about Haiti Actions event, which is happening next Saturday. We were supposed to have our comrades from Haiti Action, Robert Roth and Pierre Lavoisière from Haiti Action, join us, but given today's emergency action, we wanted to give them time next week, the day before their big event that's happening at Eastside Arts Alliance. It's going to be the 20th anniversary of the 2004 US-backed coup in which democratically elected President Jean-Bertrand Aristide and the Famille Lavalas party were overthrown. And as we know, since its liberation in the early 1800s, Haiti has been under consistent attack by Western powers, and the fight for Haitian liberation and against imperial domination is at another inflection point, just as with Palestine. And so we want to talk with them about that next week, about Palestine-Haiti solidarity in particular. And we encourage everyone to sign up and either join their event in person or plan to follow it on YouTube. There'll be members of Famille Lavalas's executive committee, Walter Turner from KPFA, Pierre from Haiti Action, and many others speaking and providing political education and analysis on the situation in Haiti. And so and there'll also be someone from the U.S. Palestine Community Action Network there as well. And so they will also be talking about the importance of Haiti-Palestine solidarity in this moment. With that, I think we're going to close out for the day and encourage you all to continue to be active, to join these PSAs and to roll out for actions whenever there's a call for one. And till next week, we're going to give, I'm going to share Samer's video just one more time as he shows us a little bit of a sense of the crowd that's out there. Samer, do you want to close us with anything, or?
I can try, but it's loud. Like these moments aren't just good to be in community together, but they are meaningfully shifting what's possible for our U.S. political class to do. We're making genocide costly, and it's great to be here with all of you. Thanks.
Thanks, Samer. Samer will be off for a couple of weeks, getting a little bit of rest and doing some other, continuing to work, no doubt. But we'll be without him for a couple of weeks, and we'll have other folks filling in. But we'll be back next week at the same time, and we'll be asking you all to keep up the fight in the meantime. Till then, thank you all. Thank you to our ASL interpreters, and we'll see you in the streets.